Thank you very much, Directora Vargas, and of course to the Academy and to Lighthouse for doing the technical part of this program, including the interpreters. It is always a pleasure to be able to speak to you. I was here 2 weeks ago, and in many ways, the program 2 weeks ago, if you were there, is part and parcel or a combination of what we're going to be talking about, but they are independent. So if you in fact did not see or participate in the program 2 weeks ago, that doesn't matter, but it will build upon that presentation. And thank you all for attending, and please ask whatever questions you wish to ask, because although we're on Zoom, we see if we can make this as participatory as possible. So, sorry. My presentation really is going to be talking about 4 related topics. I'm going to start with building on the information that we know about the LGBTTQI plus population in Puerto Rico, and then more generally in the United States, as a way of setting up the particular issues in Puerto Rico for judges and for court staff that you are likely to see, and how that relates to gender and gender expression in terms of violence. I want to then specifically look at what we know about discrimination, violence, and victimization in the judicial system and the justice system more broadly, because often, of course, people confuse police and incarceration with the courts, although they're different, but in people's heads, they're not always so different. I want to focus a little bit on youth, because this is a particular area in which gender identity and expression, and gender generally, is important. And then talk a little bit about domestic violence, because again, gender is very significant in this area, and the idea of sexual orientation or same-sex couples is also important in that area. There are many things about domestic violence. We're obviously not going to talk about all of them, but there are some particular things that are directly related to what we're talking about. So thank you. That'll be kind of our outline, and let's begin. So as I said, this is kind of a refresh your memory or recap, or if you were not a participant 2 weeks ago, this may be new information to you. So the question is, what do we know about people in Puerto Rico, and then more generally in the United States? And as I think I mentioned last time, and this is the same slide as last time, there's one very big trend that we are seeing now recently. And that is that there's an increase, the chart to the right, there is an increase in the percentage of adults who are identifying as LGBT, etc. And it's gone up over the years. And that change, and if you look at the left side, the change is primarily in bisexuals. And that's a significant issue, because it has particular relationship when we're talking about youth, and a particular interest, I think, when we get there, to judges who hear domestic violence cases and things of that nature. So that this is the trend. I don't have specific data in Puerto Rico on these issues, but honestly, it has to be the same trend. It is in fact a worldwide trend, not just the United States. So I can't imagine that Puerto Rico is different. We will know more, honestly, when we get the information from the census from 2020. So then, this is another way of looking at that same issue. The chart on the right is basically the same as the chart on the left, but the red color has increased. And that if you look at the red, it is women who are bisexual. That's where the big change has occurred over time. And so therefore, it's important for us to think about that when we're thinking about how gender, and as well as gender expression, relates to the topics of victimization and other things. That's particularly important in Puerto Rico, because one of the things that makes Puerto Rico slightly different than other places in the United States is that Puerto Rico has a very large percentage of couples, since this is the data we have, couples who are female couples, lesbians, likely bisexuals, of course, and that while this is true in other parts of the United States and in other parts of the world, it is particularly true here in Puerto Rico. So once again, we will get an update when we get the 2020 census data, but that is an important thing to remember as we go forward, because gender is important even in who is living in Puerto Rico, who is LGBTQI, etc. So I want to talk a little bit more about LGBTQQ people in the United States. And in fact, you may notice that there are two Qs here. This is something we did not talk about last week, but is actually very important for the kinds of subjects we're going to be talking about today. And that is, what is this second Q? And what does it mean? Or where does it come from? So the second Q in English, since of course this is the acronym in English, is questioning. That is to say, people who are unsure or have doubts or who are questioning their either sexual orientation or gender identity or some combination of the two of them. And that the reason that's important here today is, in fact, that's a very important segment of youth. And in fact, can be an important overlap with people who are bisexual. Bisexuals are their own group of people. But for some people, there is a transitional phase between identifying as bisexual and then identifying as lesbian or gay. It doesn't always work that way. Some people always know that they are bisexual, but others, particularly youth, are in this stage in which questioning is probably the better idea, but often they identify as bisexual as they're coming to terms or exploring their own sexuality. And that's important today because, of course, as we saw in the trend, the increase in bisexuals, particularly female bisexuals, is one of the largest areas of change in these communities. So then, given that we now know what the second Q is, let's look at some data, right? So that if you take a look at the percentage of LGBTQQ people in the United States, as I said before, there's a slightly higher percentage of women than men for adults, right? In Puerto Rico, my guess is it would be greater for women than men, but still. But if we take a look at youth, it's a much higher percentage of people who identify as LGBTQ or questioning, right? So that youth has a much higher percentage of both women, but also of people who are questioning their sexual orientation or sexual identity in that sense. Right. And that we can see this again, once again, taking a look at focusing on women. In the first one, it's adult women, right? And once again, a much larger percentage of bisexuals than lesbians. And when we're talking about female youth, the Q, questioning, or what I've said here in Spanish, people with doubts, is a large percentage of people who identify as youth. So that this is a particular term in a particular segment of the population that when you have youth or children in your courtroom, or issues involving youth or children in your courtroom, you should be thinking in mind that there is a category of particularly women who are struggling with their identity, or who are questioning their identity, or have doubts about their identity. And that's a group of people who you may not recognize in your courtroom, but I can almost assure you that they are in fact there in the courtroom. So we've seen this map before. I showed you this map. This is the difference between male couples and female couples. They live in different places. I'd like to take this slide to talk about a general point that we didn't talk about last time. And that is, one of the things that's true, and that has always been true, is that despite this idea in our heads that LGBT people live in communities with lots of other LGBT people, the gay ghetto idea, if you think about that. In fact, that's not really accurate. It's much more accurate to say that people without children can live in those urban gay ghetto kind of communities, and they tend to be male, actually, because of course fewer men and male couples have children than women, and that's true of lesbians or bisexual couples as well. But people with children, for example, live where people with children live, and for all of the same reasons. That is to say, it may be less expensive, there may be more open space or playgrounds or schools or things that children are interested in, or parents who have children are interested in. And that's different than where people without kids live, and for the same reasons. And that's true in the LGBTQ population as well. People with children live where people with children live. And that's true also of race and indigenous populations and ethnic groups, etc. And why I think this is important for judges is that if you live in an area in which you routinely see people with children, or you routinely see people of a particular racial group, or for that matter, people of with a background in indigenous populations, you are going to see LGBTQ people also with those characteristics. Because as I said, people live where other people like them live. And sexual orientation is usually a secondary reason to live in a place. People having children, people of a certain racial or ethnic community, that tends to be the more primary driver of where people live. And so that's important, as I said, for when you think about who is in your courtroom, you are likely to see your LGBT population mirroring the general population in an area. So, are there questions about sort of this demographics or other things? If so, please put them in the Q&A. As actually I think is mentioned in the Q&A, that the chat is disabled for you. It's the Q&A where I think you're supposed to put your questions. And if there aren't any, that's fine. We will have obviously other points in which we talk about this. So, all right, let's continue then. So I want to talk specifically about discrimination, violence, and victimization as it relates to what we know about gender identity in the justice system. And as I said, when I'm talking about the justice system, I'm going to use the idea of justice system that court users or the population at large tends to have, which includes not only the courts, but also on one end, the police, and on the other end, prison and incarceration. So one of the things that we know is, and these data are national data, but one of the things we know is that despite all of the advances socially that we have in the LGBTQ community, there is still a large number of hate crimes in the United States based on sexual orientation. Now, Puerto Rico, of course, as you're well aware, has a law that covers both sexual orientation and gender identity. These data don't have anything about gender identity because in a way, well, not in a way at all. It's true that Puerto Rico, because you include gender identity in your hate crimes law, you are actually much further ahead than many states in the US, not all of whom have either hate crime laws in general or hate crime laws that include both sexual orientation and gender identity. I think the thing that is important, and that it must be true in Puerto Rico as well, is the increase, right? So two things are going on. There's an increase in social acceptance and other things, and yet at the same time, there's an increase in violence against these communities. When we take a look at various aspects of discrimination, and the actual numbers are less important than kind of the trend, right? We have a significant number of people that report discrimination against them on the basis of sexual orientation in the workplace. And of course, Puerto Rico, again, has an anti-discrimination law which covers sexual orientation and gender identity in both private businesses and state employees on the basis of employment, right? So in fact, that's true. And that once again, despite the fact that there's some increase and a significant increase in social relationships, discrimination continues to exist. 27% is not an insignificant number. I wish I had the data, honestly, on Puerto Rico. I don't believe that it was collected, but it's an important issue. I would expect, honestly, the same national trend to be true here, even though the numbers may be slightly different. What I think is actually significant is this next thing. So that when they asked these questions of people, they classified discrimination in terms of ordinary discrimination. And what they meant by ordinary discrimination are these kinds of things. So these are all examples from the particular survey, which is a national survey, including Puerto Rico. And these are the questions that were under the ordinary discrimination ones. So if you notice them, with the exception of the last one about threats or bullying, they're all about how do you feel people treated you? And that's an important thing for courts. It's an important thing for courts because, of course, you're part of the institutions that people have. But if you remember also, courts, people's view of the courts is very much wrapped up in this idea of procedural justice, which is the idea of how do people feel they're treated. And one of the things that we know in general is that minorities of all types feel they are treated less well in courts than people in the majority, and that's true on the basis of race, it's true on the basis of gender, and it's true on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. When you ask people, what are your experiences like? How did you feel like you were treated in court, etc.? LGBTQ people think they're treated less well than other members of the community, and that influences this idea of procedural justice. And so that these examples of ordinary discrimination as the survey called them, are important for thinking not only about what it shows about how people think they're treated in society generally, but I imagine that there are echoes in terms of how they view the court system, the justice system, in terms of procedural fairness. And so when we look at this data, once again, the numbers themselves are not important. What's important is the trend line. What we see is, first of all, that heterosexuals, both men and women, think that they suffered this the ordinary discrimination less than LGBTQ people, and that in fact, trans people feel that they're treated worse than women who feel that they were treated worse than men, and this entire group more so than heterosexuals. So that's data which supports what we were just talking about. And then here's something that I think is very important for courts in particular, both for procedural justice purposes, but also in thinking about communities, et cetera. And that's something that this idea of intersectionality is significant in thinking about these issues, that in fact, people have multiple identities, gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, of course, but then you have a race, you have a sex, you have a national identity, you have a religion, which is of course particularly important. There are in fact LGBTQ people who are non-religious, as we might have expected, but also a significant number of people who are religious and who think of themselves in that way. And that when we were talking before about demographic data, the idea that people live in communities where others like them live, that's part of this intersectionality. People have multiple identities, and that discrimination is part and parcel and has influences on multiple identities. So the people with multiple identities that suffer discrimination, in fact, do suffer it worse than others. So let's take a look at police, because as I said, this is one of the significant ways in which people's thought process about the courts is heavily influenced by something that the courts, that's a different institution, the police, but in people's heads, they're combined. So we know that 16% of LGBTQ people report that they suffer discrimination by the police, and that in terms of intersectionality, it's a much higher percentage, a significantly higher percentage of LGBTQ people who are also members of minority groups who have suffered discrimination. So that's that intersectionality at work. We have a similar thing when we look at women, right? 3% of lesbian, bisexual, queer women report that they had significant or severe problems with the police, but it's higher, once again, if we look at the community of people who are not only LBQ people, but also members of minority groups, right? This is intersectionality, once again, at work. And that if we take a look at the other end, that is to say, the incarcerated population. So the general population of LGBT people, LGB people, not transgender. I'm going to talk about transgender people separately. In the population is more or less 3.5, at least when this data set was reported. If we look at the prison population for gay or bisexual men, which is the dark blue, or men who have sex with men, that's the light blue, who may not identify as gay or bisexual. In the prison population, that's an important distinction. There are a number of people who in the outside world, not in prison, have sex with men but don't consider themselves to be gay, right? So it's much higher. The prison population who are gay, bisexual, or have sex with men in prisons and jails is higher than the population of gay and bisexual men and men who have sex with men in the population at large. Where it's really striking, though, is when we look at the data for women, right? Lesbian and bisexual women, that's the dark red, 33% in prison, 26 and change percent in jails, and women who have sex with women is an additional thing on top of it. That's a very significant data point. Because in fact, in the prison population then, or in the population of people who are sentenced to prison or jail, the amount or the number of women in that population who are members of sexual orientation minorities, that is, say, lesbian, bisexual, or women who have sex with women, that's a huge number. And while you as judges don't have the direct responsibility for what do you do with these women in prison, the question is why? And that's one of the issues that I want to talk to you about as we continue. All right, so given this disparity, what are inmates who are heterosexuals, what do they look like, and what are their experiences in compared to lesbian, gay, or bisexual inmates? So we know a number of things about those two groups of people. So it's more likely that lesbian, gay, bisexual inmates were victims of sexual violence when they were children, and that they are victimized sexually when they are in prison or in jail, incarcerated. They are more likely in this population to be isolated or solitary confinement or have other sanctions against them. And that causes, or they are more likely to have, regardless of whether the isolation also increases this, psychological issues as a result of various things. And that we know that as a group, men, that is, say, gay men or bisexual men who are in prison tend to be older, but women tend to be younger, right? So of that huge population, 33%, et cetera, of women who are in prison or in jail, they tend to be younger people, and at least younger than the heterosexual population, right? So there are significant issues that sexuality plays in inmate populations. So the question is why? And one of the things that people have said is that stereotypes about women often affect how the judicial system and then the incarceration penal system, or for that matter, police, view lesbians, etc. And that it has to do with this perspective that women who are lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or queer identified are different from sort of feminine norms or what we expect women to be like in society generally. And that often, as an example, often we see women who are lesbian or bisexual or transgender as more masculine or aggressive. And if you perceive people in that way as a police officer, as someone in court, or for that matter, of course, as a jailer or person in charge of a prison, that has certain effects, that we see those people as more dangerous, as being more threatening, as being more deserving of a harsher punishment or harsher treatment. And that may stem from this sort of perspective of what we think women are like and how we perceive lesbians to be like, right? These are perceptions. These are not necessarily reality. And as you're familiar with already, I'm sure, this idea of implicit bias, not explicit thinking, but it's just the way you do this. Right, so there's a question, and I'll take the question a little later because I want to stop and take questions, right? And that we have similar but different stereotypes about men, and that the question is, how does that affect the justice system? So one of the things that we know about men is that conformity to masculine ideas, which tend to be men are masculine, they're macho, they have all these things, that is a predictor of aggressive behavior and either victimization or, for that matter, perpetration of violence among men, right? That we think that somehow fighting is masculine and therefore that's part of this sort of stereotype of maleness. And that all of that kind of leads to risky behaviors in men generally. Men tend to take on riskier behaviors in terms of drinking, in terms of driving recklessly, all sorts of stuff, smoking, various kinds of things. And that when that happens, people who have been imbued with these sort of stereotypical views of what men are like, or masculinity, tend to do these behaviors as well. We know that gay, bisexual, and trans men feel the same pressures about masculinity because, of course, they grow up in exactly the same kind of culture as everybody else, and that in areas in which these pressures are strong, gay men, they're strong on gay men or bisexual men or transgender men as well. And that therefore, they too engage in risky behaviors of the same type, sometimes even more so, because if you think of yourself as gay and you're not comfortable with that, you may wish to hide that identity, particularly in areas in which being gay is not as socially accepted. So you want to, in fact, take on the coloration, protective coloration environmentally of what men do. And that, of course, those risks lead to increased contact with both the juvenile justice system, but also the adult justice system. So that's part of actually what I want to say here too, is that sometimes families who reject gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, queer youth or religion or other institutions like schools mean that people are pushed out, and that these stigmatic sort of behaviors then lead people to the fringes of society in which they engage in perhaps sex work, other kinds of things we're going to talk about a little bit later, and that these risks bring people into contact with the larger justice system writ large. So I want to talk a little bit about prisons because it's significant for women, and of course women are one of the ways in which Puerto Rico is different, the higher percentage of women in the Commonwealth. So unsurprisingly, right, lesbian, gay, and bisexual inmates, right, have a higher percentage of consensual sexual relations with other inmates. That cannot be surprising to anyone. And of course it's true as a factual matter. But what that means is, because those relationships are in fact not legal in prison, that they routinely then are punished for those infractions of prison discipline and prison behavior, which means that the more kind of infractions and punishments that happen, that leads to the consequences that come from punishment. That is to say, limitation on various liberties, getting to the yard. You might have limitations on family visitation and other kinds of punishments that prison settings have for people who break rules, right? That means then that we have this idea that in fact, lesbian, gay, bisexual inmates are less obedient, more likely to commit infractions than heterosexual peers, which tends to mean then that people look at them or scrutinize them more harshly. And then they're disciplined more harshly because they are now repeat people who have these kinds of infractions. And that's true when we're looking at their behavior sexually, but also when we look at behavior that has nothing to do with sex. Once you start scrutinizing individuals, you start noticing other infractions that occur in prisons, etc. And that once you're in this category of people, then engaging in consensual sexual relations, which would be normally what we would expect people to do, although not in prison, of course. You have these greater constraints on you, and we end up with kind of a cycle of how people are treated in prisons, right? And that's based on not only stereotypes, but it's also based on behavior. Obviously, same-sex sexual activity is natural to some people and not natural to others. And that because those behaviors in prison are punished, we end up with that cycle. So the question is, what other kinds of stereotypes or schemas lead to what we might think of as discriminatory treatment, or at least higher scrutiny and other things? And right, if we start thinking of LGBT people as more likely to commit sex crimes or to engage in sex work, and that goes along with what we talked about before in terms of this idea that if you're pushed to the margins of society because you're kicked out of the home or because you have problems with family, that's a youth problem, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but also discrimination at work or other kinds of things that we talked about before, you have a limited number of choices more available to you, and that therefore you might have to participate in sex work or commit these other things. And if we think of LGBT people as more likely to do this, both factually and just we happen to notice it more, you end up with, as we said, a higher level of scrutiny. And that means that you're more likely to perceive infractions of these problems, and that leads then to higher sentences, tougher sentences, longer sentences, and incarceration. This is something that we know happens with police. Unfortunately, we don't have specific data on judges, but we do know that judges, like everybody else, have ideas in their head about who people are. And while as a judge, you know also that that's not supposed to influence your behavior, that the truth is, we know from implicit bias studies that of course it does to some degree, and that's natural, that's how we're built as people, and that judges work hard to prevent that from influencing these things. But it's not always possible to cabin your sort of implicit self from your explicit role as a judge, no matter how hard and how conscientious, excuse me, you try. So here we have opportunity to take questions. There's one already there. If you have others, I'm happy to do this. So the question is the following, because I don't know that you can all see this, but the question starts out with the premise: if most LGBT people have been molested as children, and I'll come back to that, why promote gender identity ideology in school curriculum to young students? Doesn't this increase their vulnerability or expose them to molestation? I think there are a couple underlying assumptions here which I don't think are actually accurate. So I don't think the data show that most LGBT people have been molested as children. That, in fact, is not true. There are, so that period. But let's assume that, and there are children who are molested, both heterosexual children and LGBT children. First, I don't, most in prison. So sure, but if you think about the statistics or the data about prison, two things are true. That is to say that, first of all, I suppose, if we're actually talking about gay men or lesbians or bisexuals in prisons with other adults, and it's consensual, I'm not sure that is molestation. In fact, I'm sure it is not molestation. It's consent. If we're talking about consensual sexual activity, we're talking about consensual sexual activity. It is punished in prison because all sexual activity is punished in prison. There isn't a lot of heterosexual sexual activity in single-sex prisons because the opportunity is clearly not there. It does occur, right, between inmates and guards or whatever, but all of that is punished too. I guess what we're saying is there's a higher percentage of that kind of activity in prisons because the opportunity is there. It's also true then that I think thinking about what's good for children and making decisions about what's good for children based on, if they end up in prison, this is what's going to happen to them. I think there's a couple leaps of logic there. I think those are separate issues. What's good for children is things that child psychologists and others care about. I think that's different than what happens in prisons. Lastly, one of the things that we know, and obviously I don't have this data because I wasn't prepared to talk about it, but I'm happy to talk with people afterwards. One of the things that we know is that people's both gender identity and sexual orientation manifests itself fairly early on in life. I mean, nobody says, I think, when they're 3 years old, Mom, Dad, I'm a lesbian. But kids very early know what women do, what men do in terms of gender identity, but also get this idea of, who they want to play with. And one of the things, and it's not sexual, right? But over the years, people who are gay or lesbian or bisexual start to know that about themselves often earlier than we sometimes think. And that is one of the things that child psychologists do lots of studies about. And I'm happy to talk to you about what we know about those studies of youth in a different kind of setting where I can be prepared to have that data in front of me. All right, so I want to talk, and I've separated this out about transgender and gender identity issues. So these folks are all people that I got from various transgender websites in Puerto Rico. These are all Puerto Rican trans people or people who identify as gender non-binary. And it's a diverse group, which is, of course, what we would expect. When we look at trans people, their treatment, victimization, etc., is similar to but different from lesbian, gay, bisexual folks. And that's why I want to talk about them separately. So what do we know? We know that in terms of victimization, men and women who are transgender have a significantly higher percentage of victimization per 1,000 people in the population than do non-trans people. So that if you remember from last week, or if even if you don't, if you weren't there, cisgender people who are not transgender, whose gender identity matches with the sex they were assigned at birth, they do suffer victimization, right? But it's significantly less than trans people do, right? So that gender identity and being trans significantly affects victimization. That's an enormous difference between non-trans people and trans folks. And that what sometimes happens is that people who are transgender are faced with a world which makes it very difficult, they believe, to lead a quote unquote normal life, right? That because the way they experience the world is so different and the way the world treats them as they perceive it is so different, they can't have a normal life. And that it starts with police. And once again, police are important because that colors people's perception of the judicial system as well. And that there's a phenomenon of being sort of out as trans, and that leading to harassment by police in public spaces. It's the rough equivalent, you may have heard the expression, of driving while black. The idea that an African-American person who is driving is more often cited by police for infractions that would not happen to a white person. So sort of being present as trans, there's a phenomenon that people have documented about that, and the trans people often feel that that's true. Just simply being trans in public leads to harassment and other kinds of behaviors by police. And that once, of course, you have a police record, that makes it more difficult to keep your job or to find a job or to have a stable life. It's more difficult to get apartments rented to you and other kinds of aspects of what daily life are. That's true for everybody. But if you start to have a police record, of course, that increases the difficulty in these kinds of normal situations. And that if you can't, in fact, have a stable place to live, or if, in fact, you can't get employment or keep employment, that once again, it's this idea that you get pushed to the margins of society, and then you have sort of survival crimes. Like, how do you get money? Where do you live? You end up being homeless, or you end up having to do sex work or other kinds of things like this. And that transgender people, we've seen that dynamic before, but transgender people report this to a much higher degree. And that when we take a look at intersectionality, we see the same thing. These are data, police data, as I said, from the United States generally, and unfortunately, I don't have specific data about Puerto Rico, but my guess is it is probably true for minority groups in Puerto Rico, either indigenous population or race, is that trans people who are, in this data is Black, suffer higher rates of both aggression and bullying or other kinds of behaviors than do trans people who are white, right? Or in this case, trans people who are of the majority race or ethnicity. So there was one question. I think the bottom line, by the way, is that all of the threats or behaviors that we saw when we're talking about lesbian, gay, bisexual people are increased in terms of percentage and severity for transgender folks. And that's kind of unsurprising. You would expect that as people become more accustomed to lesbians and gay men and bisexuals, if they think about bisexuals, behavior and treatment increases. Not entirely, that was the second section. But because people have less comfort and experience and understanding of transgender people and people with different gender identities, that there's more of this being pushed to the margins, which increases than the contact with the judicial system, the police system, incarceration system, etc. When we're talking about transgender people. So there is the question in the chat. So I'm not aware. So you can, I hope everybody can read the question. So the question is basically about, are there data that show a relationship between, or that might exist between, the commission of hate crimes and religious beliefs of the aggressors? I'm not actually aware of data that do that. I think we could probably get a sense of data if we looked at differences in hate crimes in particular localities. The problem with looking at and trying to compare, I don't know, hate crimes in California, say, with hate crimes in Kentucky, or hate crimes in Puerto Rico for that matter, is that, of course, a state like California, a state like Kentucky, and of course the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico is not the same from one part of the island to the other. And that we would need more granular data, more specific data on particular locations as a way of getting at the question that you're asking. I don't know that data honestly exists. So the second question is there a difference in the tendency to engage in sex work between heterosexual, homosexual, or transgender people? I'm not aware, honestly, and I'm not aware of the distinction between lesbian, gay, bisexual people and heterosexuals, although I think the data are that the vast majority of people, generally women, who engage in sex work are heterosexuals. But there is a slightly higher percentage than we would expect for transgender people. And that's because there's a much higher percentage of transgender people who are both homeless or have just suffered discrimination and can't get jobs. If we look at the data on jobs, and there's a lot of data about that, I'm happy to talk more about that. But there are a lot of data that once people come out as transgender at work, they're fired. Despite the fact that there may be laws like there are here in Puerto Rico prohibiting that. In fact, it happens. And that people have a very hard time as a transgender person gaining employment and keeping employment, and that people have to survive, and so they engage in whatever work that they can engage in. Sex work is one of those survival crimes for people. It's not the only one. Robbery, obviously, and all sorts of stuff happens. I'm not aware of hate crimes by LGBT people against LGBT people. I don't know whether that data exists, but I'm not aware of it existing. It's not in general. Hate crimes across the board, whether we're talking about religion or sexual orientation or race, ethnicity, has to be on the basis of that characteristic, and so that usually you don't see crimes classified as hate crimes when women are violent against women, or a religious group is violent against members of other religious groups. It does exist, of course. That's not usually how things are classified. They're usually majority against minority things in hate crimes. But if there are data out there, I don't know what they are. I'm sorry. All right. I want to talk about youth because youth is an important aspect of who LGBT people are. Any of you that have a juvenile assignment or other assignments in which you see youth, you are much more likely to see LGBTQ youth, and particularly questioning youth in that population in general. And so that the idea of how people are treated in victimization with youth is important. So when we're thinking about women in the juvenile justice system, is a much higher percentage, 39%, of women and adolescents who are detained in that system, and that once again we see a higher percentage of women of color or women who are or youth of color who are members of minority groups. This is US data, so Latinas are classified with Blacks. Obviously, Puerto Rico would be slightly different in terms of who gets classified as a minority group, but I don't know the actual data, but I would guess that Puerto Rico is no different in terms of people who are members of marginalized groups in Puerto Rican society, whoever that may be, would have that intersectionality affect also lesbians, bisexual, and queer women, that there's a much higher violence victimization rate in youth in Puerto Rico, as it is with slightly different groups in the United States more generally. And I think this is actually a really important point for judges. Gender expression, particularly gender non-conforming gender expression that doesn't match our views of what girls are like or boys are like, plays a really important role in bullying and victimization of youth. It's the important point is this one, actually, that the more gender non-conforming a youth is, the greater quantity of bullying and violence is perpetrated against them. And that's true whether we're talking about happening in the home or whether we're talking about schools or other institutions. And it's actually also true whether or not that victim of bullying or victimization is heterosexual or lesbian, gay, bisexual. In other words, in the youth group, and thinking about this dynamic, it has less to do with sexual orientation and more to do with how someone presents their gender. So boys who present in a more typical masculine way are treated better than boys who may have characteristics that we assume are feminine. And the same thing is true with women. And that actually we can see that in certain data. So the two ways in which people enter the juvenile justice system, one of them is physical abuse. That is to say, they're in households in which they suffer physical abuse. And that we can see a difference between LGBTQ youth and heterosexuals. But we also, regardless of sexual orientation, gender conforming youth of all types suffer less physical abuse than gender non-conforming youth, right? So that we see that, yes, sexual orientation makes a difference, and in this group is a significant difference when we're talking about physical abuse, but gender non-conformity, regardless of sexual orientation, is also a significant issue. And when we talk about who is kicked out of the home or who runs away from the home, which is the other big way in which youth enter the juvenile justice system, for some reason, this data set doesn't have information about sexual orientation. I'm sorry about that. I'm limited with the data I do have. But you can see that gender conforming youth is still considerably less than gender non-conforming youth. And that means that the kids that are in the system, the juvenile justice system, they have a higher percentage of people who enter the system because of the normal ways in which kids enter the system, violence, or being kicked out of the home, or running away from home. And that gender nonconformity is an important characteristic that we don't tend to think about when we're thinking about this population. And that it, in fact, is true for both heterosexuals and for lesbian, gay, bisexual youth, right? And that there's kind of a chain reaction in a way. And so that if we idea that often this youth, as troubled youth are generally, but LGBT youth in general, with their parents, with school, with other institutions, they're often in conflict because of the idea that the institutions, the parents, school can't deal with these kids or has a hard time dealing with them. And that this conflict leads to, of course, leaving home, going to the streets, where, of course, then as youth on the streets are subject to violence, assault, robbery, the other kinds of things that happen to people on the streets, right? And that once that happens, when they trying to seek access to services that are available for youth generally, oftentimes these services are segregated by sex, which, of course, if you're a transgender or a questioning youth or a gender nonconforming youth, may be problematic for you. Or oftentimes these institutions have a religious base, right? Oftentimes they're church sponsored or social services that are based in religious charities. And that while that doesn't have to be true, it is often true that those spaces are not comfortable for LGBTQ youth generally. And if those services or traditional ways in which people might seek help from this life on the street are less available for youth, or youth feel that it is less available to them, that we have a higher percentage, and we do, an overrepresentation of people who are homeless and who are LGBT. That's true for adults. It's also very true for youth, for children and youth. And that, of course, that leads to what we were talking about before, this idea of survival crimes. How do you make your way in a world in which you are homeless, you don't have access to the kinds of services, or you believe you cannot access services, etc.? You end up with these various both sex crimes, drugs, crime, excuse me, all of those things. And I will say this, by the way, one of the things for trans people in general, but it is also true of youth, since we're talking about youth right now, is that it's often very difficult for trans people to access medical services. And that hormones for people who are transitioning through hormones, it's difficult to obtain them through normal channels, or at least they believe that normal channels aren't going to be available to them, and that's an additional pressure to get money. That what are you going to do? How am I going to transition? How am I going to get my hormones? Hormones are not a youth thing in general, right? We can talk about this at a different time. Medical transition doesn't take place for youth. It only takes place for people who are adults, according to all of the both data, but also the protocols for medical transition. But nevertheless, the pressures that exist to engage in criminal activity in order to complete the transition that you need. I need a new wardrobe because my parents dressed me as a boy, but I feel like I'm a girl. I'm a girl internally. All of those things lead to these kinds of survival crimes. And that, of course, these are entry points into the juvenile justice system, right? So that's how it works. That's not that different, honestly, from non-LGBT youth, right? Difficulty with parents, difficulty at school, etc. Does all of these things. What is different in some ways is the access to services and the perception that services really aren't available to you because of either discomfort by service providers, but also a perception that you're not going to be welcome there, that you cannot fit into these service providers' kind of expectations. All right. So once you're in the juvenile justice system, let's talk about what happens. So being taken from the home, that's what this data is about, or being placed in particularly group home settings, which we know for youth is a less good placement than a foster home setting, or for sure a permanent adoption, right? So when we are talking about heterosexuals, let's take being taken from the family home, right? There's a much higher percentage of LGBTQ youth who are taken from the home. That's the dark blue. And that's also true for group homes between heterosexuals and LGBTQ youth. We also see the same pattern we saw before between gender conforming youth and gender non-conforming youth. Once again, a much higher percentage of gender non-conforming youth that end up being taken from the home or leaving the home and being placed in group home settings than gender conforming things. So that we have the two patterns we saw before. Sexual orientation matters and gender identity matters a huge amount, pretty much the same as sexual orientation matters. Let's talk a little bit about the foster care system, because we have information about what happens in foster care. All right. The data are that approximately 4% of cisgender, right? So gender, not transgender, lesbian, gay, bisexual, lesbian, bisexual, and queer women who are adults had in the past lived in foster care when they were children, right? So that 4% of adult lesbians, bisexual, and queer women were in the foster care system. That's higher than non-lesbian, non-bisexual, non-queer women, right? It's a relatively small number, but the fact that we have data that shows that there's a difference is important to us. And that I think more significantly is that how those women were treated in the system when they were youth is that they were often transferred from one place to another, from one location or placement to another, and often because the foster parents treated them badly because of sexual orientation or gender identity. In other words, within the foster care system, being transgender or being lesbian, gay, sorry, this is only women, lesbian, bisexual, have a less good foster care system experience than others. And often because of the fact that the foster care placement is not appropriate for them, or that the foster care parents can't handle having sexual orientation divergent or sexual identity divergent youth in their home. And that, of course, as we know, the more a child is transferred from placement to placement, and the more kinds of group homes and other kinds of failures of the system in that way, the less well the system treats them, but also the less well they come out of that system. And that this is data that we have about how gender identity and sexual orientation affect their experiences in the foster system. It's also true, I don't have the actual data because it didn't occur to me at the time, but it's also true that intersectionality plays a part in people's treatment in the foster care system. That is to say, youth who belong to minority groups have a similar pattern, and LGBT youth in the foster care system who are also members of racial or ethnic minorities or other groups like that get worse treatment in the foster care system as well, right? As a transition to what we're going to be talking about next, we have information about violence, what we might think of as dating violence. That is to say, violence in terms of the relationships that adolescents have with each other. And that what we see, both if we're talking about sexual violence and physical violence in these adolescent relationships, once again, the actual number isn't important, but what's important is the pattern, is that when we talk about lesbian, gay, bisexual students, or students who have doubts, right, the questioning group that we're talking about, they have much greater experiences with both sexual violence and physical violence in their relationships, their sort of dating or other kinds of adolescent relationships, than do heterosexuals, right? That's a fairly dramatic difference between those groups. And that if we take a look at adolescent lesbian, bisexual women, and then heterosexual women in that same age category, we also see a difference. It's true that women in these age categories generally have higher rates of violence and both sexual and physical than heterosexuals generally. But when talking about lesbian, bisexual women, it is higher still than heterosexuals. And that when we talk about men, the number of gay and bisexual women, men who have violence, either physical or sexual, in their relationships, it's considerably higher than men who are heterosexual, right? So that we see this continuing pattern, no matter how we slice the data, that heterosexual, both women and men, or as a group, suffer less of this violence in adolescent relationships than do gay men, bisexuals, lesbians, or bisexuals, or taken as a group. And that's kind of, at least I'm going to use that as a transition to the idea of what do we know about domestic violence sort of writ large. So this is not exactly domestic violence, but it is it's a problem in terms of relationships that youth have, right? So before we do that though, I want to stop for questions about how sexual orientation, gender identity, or in this case, particularly gender expression, influences the violence that youth face. I don't see any questions, but if you have questions now, I'm happy to take them. All right. So I'd like to start the domestic violence thing slightly differently. We've done an awful lot of data, and I have, of course, data because that's my sort of way of looking at subjects about domestic violence. But we've talked a significant amount over this session, and in fact, if you were around in the last session also, about the idea of people's perceptions, both of themselves and the situations that they're in, but other people's perceptions of them. So that I have some images that I've taken from Google. They are images that appear, they're the sort of top images that appear when I searched domestic violence and Puerto Rico, right? So these are the images that came up, and I want you to take a look at them. All right, so we're talking about domestic violence. This image came up. 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 One more. I'm gonna spread, so that's what I said. I Googled violence in Puerto Rico. These are the images. In the Q&A section, if you wouldn't mind, if you care to participate in this way, what do you see in these images? What are the things that you see in the various images? These are the top images that came up in Google for violencia. So there is a question. I think I'll answer it actually at the end if you don't mind. But I'd like to focus on these images. Is there something you see about these images? So one of the answers is it's only violence against women. Anything else? Only heterosexual couples, women being victims. All of those things I think are true. They reinforce and normalize abused women in heterosexual relationships. I think that's another way of saying it. So it does not show violence against people in same-sex couples. I think that's also true. And all of this stuff, by the way, is exactly right. I think those images show that. There's one thing that no one has mentioned. It's implicit in what you've said, by the way. Abuse of children, absolutely. At least one of them, the effect of children, is directly doing that. They don't show other ages. That's certainly true. And of course, abuse happens at all sorts of ages. That is absolutely true. So the one thing that I additionally see explicitly that you all have said without saying it directly is if these are heterosexual couples, and you're absolutely right, this is what this shows, and where women are victims, that would mean that men are perpetrators, right? That both halves of that perception, I think, are important. That we tend to see women as victims, men as perpetrators, and that dynamic is, of course, in heterosexual relationships. But that leaves out the truth of what we already know about domestic violence. That one, of course, is that men can be the victims or survivors of domestic violence, and that women can be perpetrators, right? If we're talking about heterosexual relationships, but it's also true, of course, as people have already said, that there's domestic violence in same-sex relationships, right? And that, of course, what we're showing in the Google images reinforces the stereotypes that often people have about domestic violence, that it simply doesn't occur in same-sex relationships or in relationships that are LGBTQ, that it's kind of a male thing. That is, say, men are perpetrators, and that if people were to think about it, lesbians don't have this problem because, of course, there are no men in same-sex female relationships. These are, of course, stereotypes. They are reinforced by these images, but those images are important for us because those are the images that sink into our sort of subconscious, that sink into the implicit bias idea. Just like we have images about LGBTQ people, we have images about domestic violence, we have images about lots of things, and that's what forms these stereotypes, perceptions, etc. And that when we see images in Google, if that's what shows up, that kind of reinforces the idea that this is what people tend to think about when they think about these issues. Of course, right, the data are that men are sometimes victims, less than women for sure, but men are sometimes victims, and that there's victimization and domestic violence in same-sex couples or in LGBTQ relationships as well, right? So the actual data are, I think, that the prevalence of domestic violence in LGBTQ people is comparable, not exactly the same, but comparable to the prevalence in heterosexual relationships. And that once again, intersectionality plays a part here. It's slightly higher in LGBTQ relationships that are members of minority groups. And that abusers or perpetrators who are LGBTQ also demonstrate the same kind of dangerousness and risks that their heterosexual peers have, right? Now, I think if we were to think about this, we would think, of course, that's true, but it's not always at the top or the forefront of how we think about things. It is true, and this is not something we're going to talk about today, but it is true that domestic violence and how it manifests itself in same-sex relationships is similar to, but also different from, how it manifests itself in heterosexual relationships. In other words, there are different sort of techniques of abuse and other things that are unique to same-sex couples or to LGBT relationships. We could talk about that at another time, but I want to focus on the gender and the gender expression aspects of domestic violence. So then, right, as it turns out, right, lesbian and gay men have essentially the same probability of suffering abuse from their partners, and in fact, as heterosexuals, but also have a greater risk or probability of suffering this kind of abuse than from violence perpetrated against the outsiders, a sort of hate crime and other kinds of things. It's actually, while that's a significant segment of violence against LGBT people, domestic violence or intimate partner violence is actually there's a greater probability in this group. And that in fact, if we're talking about gay men, it's the third largest health risk or health problem that gay men face after substance abuse and AIDS, right? So that we don't ordinarily think of men as being victims of domestic violence, period. Gay men as well. But in fact, it's the third most significant health issue that is suffered by gay men nationally, right? And then if we take a look at sort of what the data are, right? Bisexual women higher than bisexual men. I don't think that's surprising. Lesbians, a greater percentage of domestic violence over the lifetime than gay men. And that heterosexual women over a greater percentage than heterosexual men. What I think this is showing us is a couple different things, right? So that women in general are in fact more likely to be victims of domestic violence than men. So sometimes stereotypes are true. Absolutely, that's true. Lesbians in same-sex relationships more so than men. So sexual orientation is not a buffer. It is not a prohibition against lesbian women in same-sex relationships suffering domestic violence, and that bisexuals are actually higher than their counterparts. Bisexual women higher than lesbians, higher than heterosexual women, bisexual men higher than gay men, higher than heterosexual men. And that if you remember the very first stuff we talked about when we were talking about population groups and what do we know about LGBT people, is that bisexuals, as it turns out, particularly with women, but bisexuals are by far the largest group within the LGBT population. And that bisexual women are actually victims of domestic violence much more so than either lesbians or straight women. And that because bisexuals are often, we don't think of them because they may be invisible, because we simply are not thinking about that group of people. That is an increasingly greater percentage of the population, the LGBTQ population, and that when we're thinking about domestic violence, we should actually specifically think as judges, as people in courts, as people who see these cases, what kind of a relationship is this? Is this person a bisexual? Because often those things go under the radar. And they go under the radar for the following reason. So up on top is just the same data about lesbians and gay men and bisexuals. That's not any change. That's just there to keep it in your head. But if we take a look at the relationships in which domestic violence occurs for bisexual women, bisexual men, for lesbians and gay men, what we see is something probably you didn't think about, which is most bisexuals, either men or women, are in relationships with people of a different sex. So in other words, bisexual women tend to be in relationships with men. Bisexual men tend to be in relationships with women. And that when we look at who perpetrates abuse against bisexual women or bisexual men, it is people of a different gender. Then that means that when these couples show up in your courtroom, you may not see them as a bisexual relationship at all. And you may not see the dynamics that occur in a bisexual relationship that are different from the dynamics that occur in a heterosexual relationship, even though it's a male-female relationship in front of you that masks or hides the differences that can exist in a bisexual relationship or relationship with a bisexual person and a person of a different gender. that would be different from heterosexual ways in which domestic violence occurs or domestic abuse, the sort of techniques of abuse, etc., that exist, right? So that in fact, this is a significant point that it may never have been brought to your attention and that you may never see because it's kind of masked by the idea that what you have in front of you is a male-female couple. When we take a look at same-sex couples, it may be obviously more obvious to you that this is a same-sex couple in a domestic abuse or domestic violence situation. But we also see that some of these relationships, particularly with women, and in Puerto Rico, you remember that most of your same-sex couples, 70%, are female same-sex couples, and only 30% are male same-sex couples, at least according to the census data. So there's going to be a significant number of lesbians who are in relationships, even though they identify as lesbians, with a man. And that those women are suffering domestic abuse as well. That would be the red number, not the blue number. And that when we talk about gay men, gay male relationships, gay men tend not to be in relationships with women. There are some, and there's some domestic violence in those relationships as well. But you're more likely to see domestic violence in male couples as male-male, and therefore you would recognize that, and you can think about what those dynamics are that are different, what the techniques of abuse are that are different. But for lesbian couples, there's going to be 30% of the lesbian couples that are not actually, that one of the women is lesbian, and she's the victim of domestic violence, but she's in a relationship with a man. And that, once again, this may be a hidden version of domestic violence that you had not thought about, okay? So for transgender people, transgender folks in relationships, whether with a man or with a woman, whether it's a same-sex relationship or a different sex relationship, suffer domestic violence at a greater rate than cisgender couples do, right? And that we know in general, by the way, that with cisgender couple domestic violence, that only about 50% of people or of incidents are reported to the police. When we're talking about domestic violence against transgender people, that number is considerably less. It's only a quarter of domestic violence perpetrated against transgender people are reported to police, right? So if there's this hidden sort of crisis of domestic violence in cisgender couples, it is even more hidden and even more or even less likely to be dealt with by the police or by the courts when we're talking about domestic violence against transgender people. All right, so how do gender stereotypes, et cetera, influence people's perceptions of domestic violence, right? So when we're talking about a female victim, whether she's a female victim in a same-sex couple or in a heterosexual couple, we consider, that is to say people, stereotypes of people, consider that the gravity of the domestic violence is not important. We recognize that domestic violence can occur with grave consequences, can occur with psychological consequences, all sorts of things. We have a much broader idea of what domestic violence looks like when women are victims. With men, whether we're talking about same-sex couples or whether we're talking about men that are victims of domestic violence by a different sex partner, we have a very different perception and reaction to that violence. It's almost always the case, statistics wise, that the gravity of harm is what triggers participation by the police and by the judicial system. That until harm reaches a level against men as victims, either in same-sex couples or in different sex couples, police don't deal with, they kind of ignore this system or slough it off. And that happens sometimes in the judicial system too. And that it's necessary then that an important crime or important harm happen to male victims before domestic violence is taken seriously as a problem in both courts and for sure by the police. And it's part of this idea that men simply are not victims. It goes back to the perceptions that we were talking about when we were talking about the Google images, that in fact, it's one of the things that makes domestic violence against men different than domestic violence against women, right? And that, of course, the more you know about these things, the better you're able to address them in your courtroom. You don't have control over the police, but of course, the same would be true in a law enforcement training were we to do one. And that, as I said, I'm focusing in this presentation on the issues involving gender and domestic violence, because that, of course, is the point of both the Congreso, but also of the of this segment, this presentation. But it is definitely true that the dynamics in lesbian relationships, in gay male relationships, in bisexual relationships, in relationships with transgender people, both as victims and perpetrators, those dynamics, a lot of them are the same, and you already have familiarity with dealing with those dynamics and being able to ask questions about them and get evidence about them and understand what is happening in those relationships, because you're familiar with those things. They have parallels to heterosexuals. But it is also true that there's data and ways in which same-sex couples deal with each other, or couples in which one of the parties or both of the parties is transgender, deal with each other, or a bisexual relationship, which don't have parallels in the heterosexual relationship domestic violence. I'll leave that for another day, but those can also be influenced by gender and gender expression. It's just that that's kind of a bigger topic, and opening up that topic at this point, other than to simply say it is different and we need to think about those things, is probably beyond the scope of what we're talking about here. All right, so one last few things. When we think about Google images, all of that stuff, we're thinking about schemas of how we view men and women and how we view the presentation of men and women. In other words, what does a woman look like? What does she do? How does she dress? What are her interests? What happens to her in daily life? We have all of these images and views about what women are like, what men are like. And the question is, how does that kind of affect domestic violence by police, in terms of reactions by police and in terms of reactions in the court system? What do we know? So we know a couple things. We know that in general, people perceive same-sex couples as equal. That is to say, they're both men, they're both women, but also equal in terms of physical size, right? We don't have a man overpowering a woman like in those images, right? That's not how we view what's going on. We view them as equal in terms of social status and other kinds of things, so that if we view these same-sex couples as equal, that means that oftentimes the kinds of implicit bias stereotypes that we rely on when a police officer is faced with a domestic violence dispute, or with a judge sees a couple in a domestic violence dispute, although we try to prevent this from happening, we can't help but have our implicit associations go into effect. Oh, the woman is the victim, right? We know that that's not true. Data helps, but the truth is we also know that knowing accurate information only helps to some degree, that it takes a conscious effort as a judge, as a police officer, as a teacher, as anybody, to overcome the implicit biases that do exist, right? So because we see people on these same-sex couples on a more equal level, those things are not triggered. And yet at the same time, we can't release those things. In other words, we still think that, oh wait, perpetrators ought to be women. Perpetrators ought to be men and victims ought to be women. And that we expect men are aggressive and that women are not aggressive. And that even though we know that that's not true, and even though we have a same-sex couple in front of us, what that sometimes means is that we don't see the domestic violence that's there, or we think it's mutual abuse. Oh, instead of ordering one person to stop abusing the other or kick them out of the home or whatever it is, we think we need a mutual order, because I can't tell who the perpetrator or who the victim is because they're the same. They're the same sex, they're the same height, weight, whatever. And that sometimes happens in domestic violence cases. For same-sex couples, there's many more orders, which are mutual orders of protection, as opposed to what happens in different sex couples. And that we often then, when we're looking at a same-sex couple, perceive masculine perpetrators, regardless of whether we're talking about men or women. The more masculine someone appears, or the more masculine gender expression that someone has, we think of those individuals as more likely to initiate aggressive behavior, to be the perpetrator, to be the ones inflicting physical and emotional harm, in comparison with perpetrators who are feminine. That is to say, we think that domestic violence by masculine appearing people, whether they're men or women, it doesn't matter, but masculine appearing partners is more likely, more serious, they're the perpetrators, etc., than when in fact we have perpetrators that have the more feminine characteristics. And that for same-sex couples then, we have this sort of masculinity, femininity perception that we may not recognize in ourselves, but in fact is part of the typical way in which we view domestic violence, and which we view masculinity as more aggressive than femininity. And that then people, including police, of course, but also including judges to a different degree because you're in a different point in the system, that we think of violence by more masculine perpetrators against feminine victims is more significant, more serious, more threatening than violence by feminine perpetrators against more masculine appearing individuals. Or within same-sex couples, we tend to see, as I said, that there's equal and therefore more mutual kinds of orders, right? And that you may not be realizing this, and I'm not saying that everybody does this, but it is a common trope of what we think about when we think about masculinity and femininity. And it not only applies to heterosexual relationships, it applies to lesbian, gay, bisexual relationships, and that it applies to transgender people. The more masculine appearing someone is, the more our triggers about what masculinity means in domestic violence go into effect, and our triggers for femininity go into effect in that way as well. So I want to leave you with something that is a little short video, and then we'll talk about it.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Go!
So I think that may be the bottom line of my presentation, is that we know when we see certain gender patterns, because we're familiar with them, we see them, we look for them, and we find them. We find them not only in the heterosexual communities, but of course we find them in LGBT people. We don't always think about, though, the gender and gender identity and gender expression affects differences that exist within the LGBTQ population, and how that affects violence and victimization, and the various ways in which people interact with the system, either as juveniles or as adults, but they're still there, right? And that, as the little video said, it's easy to miss stuff you're not looking for. But once you start to look for them, it turns out that, like everything else, you're much better at perceiving these things. And that would be, I think, the bottom line, is that think about how this affects how gender identity, how gender expression, how gender generally affects people within the LGBT community, because it affects folks in those communities in similar but different, slightly different ways than it affects people in the heterosexual relationship. And that these individuals are in front of you in court, and that it's important to think, who is the person that's really in front of me, and what do I know about them, and what are my expectations for them.